This episode is brought to you by Puma Running.
I'm really after a new race day shoe. Can you tell me a bit more about the Puma Fast R2?
The Puma Fast R2 are my favourite race day shoe. Now, I ran in these for Chicago Marathon, and I definitely think they helped me on my way to a 4-minute PB where I ran 2:23, just because they save your legs so much, which is obviously very helpful for marathon running.
What do you think makes them so special?
Two things I think really make the difference. Firstly, this carbon plate that you can see extends right beyond the forefoot. That just gives you an extra spring on each step, really propels you forward. Secondly, the nitro foam. This is nitrogen infused foam, which gives you maximum cushioning and maximum energy return. So that means you are more efficient each stride and can essentially run faster for longer.
Okay, I'm sold.
Well, I have great news for our 5 Miles Easy UK listeners. We have a race special discount code for Puma Running. Enter 5ME20 at Puma Running to get 20% off.
It was 30 female athletes with a stress fracture. Within the following 12 months, 10 of those sustained another stress fracture.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's often in the opposite leg. So single leg injury, double leg problem. If you could bottle up sleep and sell it, you'd make billions. It is so essential.
Just tell us a bit about why do we actually get injured?
Those people who sleep for, less than 6 hours for a number of weeks will have a significant increased risk of developing a new injury.
Can you tell the difference if it's a injury or a niggle versus if it's just, say, some tightness, some fatigue? And should you ever run through that pain? Welcome back to 5 Miles Easy. Today we're talking running injuries. The worst part about any sport is getting injured, and arguably the hardest thing about getting through marathon training is getting through it injury-free. So how do we give ourselves the best chance of making the start line without getting injured? That's what we're going to find out from today's guest, Aidan O'Flaherty, specialist physio and running coach, also known as the Irish Physio on Instagram.
You may remember that Aidan was on the show just a little while ago on episode 13 to tell us all about the importance of strength training for runners. So if you missed that episode, make sure you go and check it out. But we had such an amazing response from that, we decided to get Aidan back on the sofa to delve into more of his physio knowledge, but this time in relation to injury, rehab and recovery. So, Steph, we're going to be getting some top tips from Aidan today on injury prevention. But what do you do in your training?
I think there are a few things that help prevent injuries. So I think the big thing for me actually is recovery. So making sure you're eating enough and at the right times and also sleeping enough. And then also just staying on top of my weaknesses. So the strength stuff, I've got a few weaknesses and they can crop up from time to time. But actually, if I'm on top of the strength work, I don't feel them as often.
All great points. I mean, recovery it's sometimes hard to think of it as part of training because rest can feel like doing nothing.
Yeah.
But it's such an important part to get the most from your training.
Yeah,
Sometimes
exactly.
easier said than done, but...
Yeah, exactly. And after you've worked really hard in a session, it's the time where your body can adapt to that training and also just get the energy it needs to repair those muscles so that they don't break down too much. And what do you do to stay injury free?
I think two key things for me, strength training. Now, this is actually something that I feel like I've changed the most in the last 2 years, going from not doing a lot of it and just being really inconsistent to now I'm really consistent with it, thanks to Aidan, who sets my plan, and I make sure I'm progressing with it as well. I think that's a really key thing. Second thing I do is get a weekly massage, which I find really helps, and might sound a little bit extra doing that every single week, but I just find it loosens off all the tightness, and so that tightness doesn't become something worse.
Yeah, I mean, you say it sounds a bit extra, but you're a full-time athlete, so getting a weekly massage, if that's going to help you, I think absolutely makes sense. And also what you said about the strength work and progressing it each week, I feel like that's quite motivating when perhaps the gym stuff is the thing we enjoy the least. It kind of keeps you going back feeling that you're seeing progress. How I feel in the gym is like, I know I'm never going to be the best person lifting weights, but I still feel like quite badass when I'm in the gym, like lifting heavy. I'm like, this is really cool. So it kind of makes me enjoy it now.
I totally agree. I think just having that, naturally we always want to progress at things, and being able to do that and have a plan that says, okay, this week you've got to challenge yourself to do this extra bit. I like the challenge of it. And I find that gets me into the gym, even on a Sunday night, which is my death shift of the week because it's after long run and it's the last thing I want to do. But
getting there's the hardest.
Yeah, getting the heaviest weight in the gym is the door. That's what they
say.
Love that. And it's so true. Right, should we get Aidan on the show?
Let's do it.
Aidan, thanks so much for coming back on to 5 Miles Easy today. We're so excited to have you again. Today we are chatting all about injuries, and you must see quite a lot of them as a physio. But first of all, just tell us a bit about why do we actually get injured? What happens on a physiological level when our bodies break down and we pick up a niggle?
Well, firstly, thanks for having me back. Great to be back in the hot seat again. I feel like I've seen a lot of you two recently, which is good, in the gym, strength training. So in terms of running related injuries, when we look at, I guess a good place to start would be like the incidence and the prevalence. So we see from anything from 15 to 80% of runners will get injured, which is a huge amount. Obviously, we've got the health benefits of running, but along with running, there's a high risk of developing injuries. It's part of it. Now, when we look at why runners get injured, very complex area of literature that we need to delve into, but a nice way of us explaining it is looking at our capacity. So if people who are listening on podcasts rather than video won't be able to see this, but if I use my right hand as my capacity and the left hand as my training load, we want our capacity, our body's ability to tolerate load, to be higher than what our training load is. So once we exceed our capacity and we go beyond what we can tolerate, tissue will generally break down. So if let's say we take a structure like the Achilles, that Achilles tendon has a certain capacity to tolerate load. When we go beyond that, tissue starts to fail, break down, we get pain, and then we end up having to take a few days off getting injured. But there's lots of different things that can affect capacity, which I'm sure we'll go into.
So what's the most common cause of reaching that capacity?
Great question. So quite often you will see training load errors. So when people do too much too soon, which we've all been guilty of at one point or other within our running careers, mainly when we're looking at increasing training load, you'll have people who, let's say they're used to running twice per week. Then all of a sudden they sign up to run a marathon, and now they're running 4 times per week. They're doing intensity sessions, they're doing tempo sessions, so they're increasing more than one variable. So our body don't like massive jumps or spikes in load. So if you look at someone's Strava, and I often do when they come into clinic, let me have a look and just get an idea of what you're doing. You'll often see there's like big spikes, like mountain peaks, what you want to see. And I know, Steph, from looking at yours is very consistent, very, very gradual. You want to see gradual increases in training load and try not to change more than one variable at a time, it can be difficult, and often we learn the hard way. But once we figure out what's the sweet spot for us as an athlete, it leads to great progress as we go forward.
How do we actually figure that out? Like, how do we figure out what our current capacity is? And I guess because we want to progress, how do we figure out what the correct progression is? I know you said sometimes it's just a case of learning the hard way, but if you could set a kind of sensible progression plan week on week, what might it look like?
Yeah, so you'll hear a lot of people that will refer to the 10% rule. But if you're doing nothing, 10% of running once per week is going to take you a hell of a lot of time to build up. So then we look at when people go over 30% per week, we see that the increase in running related injuries will go up. So there's this kind of grey area between 10 and 30%. And it is a case of, yes, we do tend to learn the hard way. But one thing I would always say is look at what you're currently doing, and we look at external factors and internal factors. So how do you feel when you're training? So if we look at a given training block, how are you responding to it? Are you getting sufficient sleep? Are you feeling well within yourself? What's your mood like? And if you feel you're managing your training well, then you know there's this thing is referred from a guy called Scott Dye, envelope of function. So when we do very little training and we do nothing, we're deconditioning. We have this area where we're in a good place of homeostasis, where we load, we recover. And then when you're training for performance, we're always close to that line because we're trying to get fitter, we're trying to get faster, we're trying to get stronger. Once we go beyond that envelope of function, that's where injury occurs. So generally, a lot of athletes will have a rough idea of where their sweet spot is. And sometimes we do need to push the boundaries, but it's making sure then when we do that and we do pick up injuries, we learn and we adapt from it. We reflect, okay, what things can I do better going forward? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it's so hard, isn't it? Because I think sometimes when training's going so well, you're like, I can keep going. And you can almost get carried away, and you need to remind yourself, like, actually, things are going well. This is when I need to rein it in, absorb the training and not push it too hard. But people say you always get injured when you're almost at your fittest.
Yeah, and it's such a good point about when you feel things are going really well, and that's where the discipline comes in. So let's say you have a deload week and you're like, oh, but I feel really good. I just want to push it a little bit. Often there is a latent response when it comes to a running related injury. So it's not from a particular session and then you experience pain. It could be a lag from 3 to 6 weeks prior. And we'll go into it later with bone stress injuries, but often it is as a result of what you've done in the previous weeks. So when you're feeling good and you have a deload week, that's where we need to be disciplined and say, okay, my body needs time to adapt. It needs time to kind of catch up with the training and the stress that you put it under. So that's where we need to, it's not always easy, but you will hear, and listening to Josh Kerr, he said he's really disciplined when it comes to, you know, all his other lifestyle factors. And yeah, it takes time for us to learn what works best for each individual.
I just want to go back to that 10% and the 30%. Is that in relation to mileage, or is that in relation to intensity, or both?
Great question. So there's a great researcher based out of Memphis called Max Piquet, and he looks beyond weekly mileage. A lot of people will look and, okay, well, if you have one athlete who's running 50 miles, let's say 2 athletes running 50 miles per week, what are they doing within those miles? So are they doing fast hill sessions? Are they doing intensity? So you need to look beyond the weekly mileage and look at what the intensity of those sessions are. So running faster or running harder is significantly greater in terms of the magnitude of load. So you might have an athlete that's running 100 miles per week to the extreme level, and then you might have an athlete that is running 50 miles per week. But the athlete that's running 100 miles could be doing it at zone 1, zone 2. The athlete that's doing 50 miles could be a middle distance runner, and they could be doing a high percentage of that at a higher intensity. So therefore, they're likely going to be they could be at greater risk of picking up an injury. So we see for a 10% increase in intensity and magnitude of load, it takes 50% less loading cycles to pick up an injury. So magnitude of loading is quite important. So speed is always going to be a big factor when we look at a running related injury.
Interesting. And then, so if you do feel pain when you're running, what action should you take? How can you tell the difference if it's a injury or a niggle versus if it's just, say, some tightness, some fatigue? And should you ever run through that pain?
A great question. And one thing I want to kind of get across as well is, you know, we'll be talking about lots of injuries that can lead to us having time out of running, but most often, most running related injuries are not serious. When we're looking at soft tissue, it doesn't warrant complete rest unless we're looking at a bone stress injury. So you can, if you're looking at, we say tendon, for example, you can work, I often use a traffic light system. So green light is 0 to 3 out of 10. Amber is, you know, up to 4. And then red is 5 and beyond. That's where we know we're going to be doing a bit more harm. So you can train with running isn't a pain-free sport. So you can train with a low level of symptoms, providing we look at a certain number of parameters. Are you having to modify your running gait during the run? Are you running with a limp? Are you getting pain and stiffness the next day? These are signs that we might want to reflect and maybe go and seek professional advice. But if you're running and you get a low level of discomfort and then it's not affecting your day-to-day activities, the next day you wake up, you're back to baseline, then you're pretty safe to continue running.
This is going to sound a bit of a stupid question, but I've often been asked, what, like, rate your pain, 0 to 10. And I'm like, well, I don't really know. It's so hard to pinpoint it. I'm like, well, I don't want to be melodramatic and say it's high level. So what is a good way of judging it? You mentioned about changing your gait might be one of them, but how do we actually determine what is bad pain, where we should stop and where we can carry on?
So if you're looking at pain, it's subjective, right? So what might be a 3 for you could be a 6 for you, Steph. So it is very subjective. And you ask that question and you often get people like, I don't understand what my pain level is. So a couple of key things that I would often refer to is what is acceptable for you. So if you're running, okay, I'm aware of symptoms and that's fine. I know I can accept that and it settles after. Great. Now to come back to your question again, when your pain is increasing as you're running and it's getting worse, then that's a sign that that's perhaps too much. You'll often get a warm-up pattern with tendon-related injuries. So when you start running, it feels a bit stiff, it feels a bit sore, but then it's gone in the middle and to the end of the run and you feel fine after. So that's acceptable. So there, for me, it's increasing pain throughout a run that isn't settling after. That's a bit of a warning sign.
And when should you get a scan? Is that just for bones, or do you think that's helpful for tendons? What would you do?
Generally, when we're looking at MRI scans, we're looking to rule out any significant injury. So most running related injuries won't require a scan. When we're looking at bone stress injuries, then the MRI is a gold standard. So an X-ray will show a fracture, but it might miss other things. So like a stress response, which is what happens on that journey of a fracture. So if you're looking at a bone stress injury, I would often have a low threshold to refer an athlete for a scan because of the risks if I miss it. So when we're looking at going for MRI scans, we're trying to rule out any sinister pathology if we think it's not musculoskeletal. And when we're looking at running related injuries, bone stress injury is one that we definitely would want to be looking at an MRI scan.
What are the main causes for a bone related injury?
It's a lot to unpack with that, but when we're looking at, so bones are constantly remodeling. It's a living organism, unlike other structures. If you look at like a bridge or something, for example, our bones are breaking down and they're remodeling. It's a continuous cycle. So what happens is when we're looking at a bone stress injury, we get new bone that comes in to clear out old bone, and that's a continuous cycle. Now, when our rate of healing is exceeded by the rate of loading, that's where the bone starts to get a bit weaker. So if people visualize the inside of a bone, you've got lots of these little micro cracks. And when those micro cracks become a bit bigger and they join together, it reduces the mechanical fatigue resistance of a bone. So if you imagine if you're bending something, the fatigue of that particular area, if we look at the shin, that area becomes weak in that specific point. So when the new bone cells come in to clear out the old bone cells, that's a continuous cycle. But if it's happening at a slower rate, for example, other things like energy deficiency, relative energy deficiency, low energy availability, all of this stuff is going to affect that mechanism at a cellular level. So yes, in simple terms, the rate of healing is exceeded by the amount of load, and therefore eventually the bone becomes painful. It's an overuse injury, and eventually it might turn into a stress fracture.
Okay, so it feels like there's a lot of things to keep on top of to avoid injuries. So then when it comes, the difference between bone injuries and then say muscular tendon injuries, what's the difference between the two? And in terms of rehab, is there a difference in how you recover from both of them?
There is, yeah. So when we're looking at bone stress injuries, you will need a period of rest. So for the short period, we're looking at the bigger picture. We need to understand, is there anything underlying that might be contributing to this person's bone health? And we want to make sure that we're referring to the right people, whether it's a dietitian or it's a sports physician, to get some blood tests done. Is there any deficiency in vitamin D? So we want to be looking at the bigger picture when it comes to a bone stress injury. And a history of a bone stress injury is the biggest risk factor for developing another bone stress injury. Now, you offload for a period, you get all the other tests done that you think might be appropriate, and then you look at restoring the strength of that given area. So if we're looking at bones, generally healing times, depends if it's a high risk or low risk, but it's up to anything from kind of 9 to 12 weeks. So we often see and there's a great study done on, I think it was 12 female athletes who sustained a stress fracture. And it was 30 female athletes with a stress fracture. Within the following 12 months, 10 of those sustained another stress fracture.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's often in the opposite leg. So single leg injury, double leg problem. So if we unpack that a little bit, why might that be? So if you're offloading an area, you're not doing a huge amount of exercise, you might be deconditioning a bit, and you forget about the unaffected limb and you do all the rehab on the affected side. So when someone comes into me with a bone stress injury, I'll straight away, most of the times I'll get them loading the unaffected leg to a high level, because we need to protect the full skeleton. And running isn't a great bone building activity, which is why we see lots of bone stress injuries. And this is where things like high impact loading, multi-directional loading. So I'll often get people doing, when they're ready, doing box jumps, pogo hops, and that helps build the strength and the fatigue resistance of the bone. Now, when you look at soft tissue injuries, less complicated in a way. You're looking at up the kinetic chain. Is there any deficits in strength? And we've done a number of testing in the gym, and you'll have identified particular areas that we might to work on. But when it comes to soft tissue rehab, we need to be restoring the capacity of that tissue. And then, there's lots of things that might contribute to that. Is it biomechanics? Is it lack of nutrition, lack of sleep? There's quite a few things that we can look at.
So we all know how important good nutrition is to fuel our running performance. But one thing I get asked about a lot is how to fuel training sessions, because gels can be quite hard to tolerate and quite hard to get used to.
Especially as a lot of sports nutrition is heavily processed with artificial ingredients, not always that great on the stomach. But recently we've been trying Forte and loving it, haven't we?
We have. Forte is a natural way to fuel your performance. Their gut healthy bars, recovery shakes, and performance enhancing gels and chews are all made from real natural ingredients with no junk and additives, easier on your stomach and overall better for you.
And they taste delicious too. Chef-made recipes and so many incredible flavours. There's something for everyone, for every activity.
Favourite product?
My favourite product is the energy bar. Really good straight after a session or on the go.
I love this one. This is the recovery shake, and they just taste so delicious after a hard training session.
Thanks to Forte for supporting this podcast. Head to veloforte.com and get 30% off by entering the code 5miles at checkout. That's the number 5 and the word miles.
So apart from strength training, great one for both rehab and future injury prevention, what about cross training as a way of, I guess, rehab, but also keeping fit? Because I guess there's a bit of a balance between, you're injured, and we spoke earlier about injuries occur because you've exceeded your capacity. So there must be some element of you need to decrease that load, rest, recover, but at the same time you need to stay fit and keep everything kind of in tone and moving to prevent other injuries. So what in your opinion is the right balance there?
So yeah, you're absolutely right. You want to maintain good cardiovascular, cardiopulmonary health whilst you're injured. So cross training is a great tool. Now, finding the right balance is key. So if you have someone who might have a bone stress injury or an injury that is going to take a little bit longer, often they will replace their training with a huge amount of cross training. And I think that's okay, providing they don't have other issues like psychological issues where they feel like they need to exercise. They use it to help with other things. So, I know a number of athletes I've worked in the past where the first 2-3 weeks we said, okay, let's not do anything. And, they were doing 10 to 12 hours on the bike. Okay, that's a bit of a red flag. So you need to have the ability initially to just back off a little bit, allow the area restore. But cross training is an essential part of running injury, because runners want to train. You know, we want to train, we want to exercise, we want to maintain fitness, but it is finding the right balance. And what often gives me that kind of red flag is when someone, if I ask them to just cut back a bit and they struggle to do so, then I think, okay, well, what's your relationship with exercise? Is there anything else in the background that might be going on? And, you know, that can be beyond the physio scope, where we might need to get them to speak to someone else, but it's something that we do need to be keeping an eye on.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. So when other things might be going on as well, as a physio, is it important for you to then refer them to a specialist in that area? Is it a bit of a red flag if someone goes to a physio and they try and solve every issue going rather than referring them to the right person?
Yeah, well, we want athletes and runners to have a good self-efficacy, where they want to look after their own health and they feel like that they know their bodies well. But we have to look at lifestyle factors, which is a huge part when it comes to injury, like managing stress levels, managing, you know, your sleep and all these other factors. So when you feel like there's other things that are contributing, it is important for a physio then to know, okay, well, this is my scope, I know what I'm good at. And it's really important then to have good people that you can refer to. So I'm lucky here in London, you've got Renee McGregor and all these other kind of great sports physicians that I can refer to, that will be able to give them the help in that side. And we spoke about this, as I think recently, Steph, as well, about lifestyle factors and how important it is to keep good control of everything else in order for your training to go well. Would you see that with your lifestyle factors when it comes to your training?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. When I notice it so much, like when I take on too much, then it's almost, I can keep going, and then I crash. And it's, for me, it takes like a couple of weeks for it to set on, but then I notice my training performance dipping, and I'm like, okay, a couple of weeks ago I really overcooked my schedule and now I'm paying the price. But I think it's such an interesting point, because I can so relate to the desire to keep training, because it makes me feel good. And if I don't exercise for a day, I feel a bit crap. And then especially if you're injured, you want to make yourself feel better. And if exercise is your way of making yourself feel better, and it is like great for mental health, then it is hard to stop. And I think that's actually where specialists and having someone objective to come in and set a plan for you is so important. Because I know, speaking from experience, I need someone to tell me to, okay, stop, rest for this period, and you've got to do it. And then I can do it, because I'm like, right, now my mission is to follow this plan and do as I'm told, and I've got purpose, rather than just sitting there thinking about not feeling great because I can't do what I love.
Yeah, and even at the elite level, it scales down to recreational athletes. Is, you know, we learn from, you know, what you guys do, and for us is we can take that, you know, might be for working late at night and, you know, high stress levels, you're not managing your workload, or, you know, your relationships at home, or whatever it might be, is making sure that all of that's, and we're going to have it. We're going to have stresses within our life, but it's adapting your training appropriately to that, because then we maintain the consistency. So if you look at training for a marathon, you've got 100% of your sessions. Is it fair to say if you get 80 to 90% of those done, you're going to be pretty good on the start line? And whereas if you have these other stresses and you try to, you know, okay, I'm not going to listen to my body, I'm going to push today, rather than, okay, I'm just going to back off slightly, then all of a sudden you might miss 20 or 30% of your training sessions because of an injury. So it's just learning how to pull back, and that's the trick. It's tough.
I feel like, and this is so common, it's always easier to, you know, give advice, but it's harder to practice what you preach. But I always say to people, just look at the bigger picture. If you miss this session, you've done weeks of great training. Missing one session, you're not going to get more unfit. You're not going to get slower. It's only going to benefit you. And you have to remind yourself that that's the case if you need to miss a session yourself, because as you said, you'd rather miss one session than have 2 months of missed sessions later down the line.
100%.
What about some other things that, if someone's injured right now, what and wants to get back to running as soon as possible, what else can they be doing? What about things like stretching, anti-inflammatories, heat and ice, which I swear I get told something different for every single time by so many different people. So what's your take on all of that?
So if you're looking at general recovery, I would often refer to as like the pyramid, like what is the most important. So the bottom of that pyramid is going to be your sleep. If you could bottle up sleep and sell it, you'd make billions. It is so essential. I know it's what everyone will say, oh, you need to sleep, but it's when we look at injuries and new injuries, those people who sleep for less than 6 hours for a number of weeks will have a significant increased risk of developing a new injury. And same with bone health, so we know sleep is essential. So getting your 7 to 9 hours sleep is really important. And we have all these things like Oura rings, Whoop bands, and often people will delve into deep sleep, REM sleep. Those wearables are not incredibly accurate at those different things, but what it's really good at is your overall sleep time. So 7 to 9 hours for an adult is essential. So when someone comes into me, I'll say, look, I can give you all of the rehab and the exercise, and yes, you need to adhere and do it, but this other stuff, the nutrition and the sleep, is going to be the big building blocks that we're going to stack to allow the exercises to actually take effect. So sleep and nutrition is the main chunk, and then obviously rehydration as well. And then when you look at other adjuncts, that extra, say 15 to 10%, you have cold compression. And again, that stuff, lots of people will look for quick fixes. So if you're doing the other stuff, I think these things can have a benefit. When you're looking at cold compression, cold immersion, ice baths, it's hugely popular. Lots of psychological benefits for it. So I would never tell someone don't do it. But when you ask people what do they think it does, it's often not what the research will tell us. It's good for alleviating pain. It's good for making us feel better. But in terms of like at a cellular level and tissue repair, it's not as good as what people think it is.
What about anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen? When should you take it and when should you not? I'm always a bit skeptical because inflammation is obviously a natural reaction. It's your body healing, but then sometimes it can be bad. So what's the line?
Well, as a physio, that will be outside of my scope to give people, medical advice on anti-inflammatories. However, I'll give you like what I know within the research. So when you look at people who take anti-inflammatories for an acute injury, inflammation is there to help repair and remodel tissue. So people used to often use the acronym RICE, Rest, Ice, Compress, Elevate. The new one that we use is Peace and Love. And part of that, the A in the piece is anti-inflammatory. So we would say avoid taking anti-inflammatories for an acute injury because it can affect that inflammatory process. We need that there to help repair and restore tissue. Now, when you're looking at bone health, people will often, another red flag when people are coming in and they're taking paracetamol and anti-inflammatories, we know that can affect, if you're taking it for a long period, it can affect bone healing. So again, that's another thing we wouldn't want to, but that's what I know within the research. And I don't think it's what people should be doing when they're training generally, because that inflammation is a natural process. We can't shortcut biology. So, but yeah, I would also speak to a doctor about that because it is outside my scope.
Yeah. What is peace and love? I've never heard this term. What does that stand for? I'm
probably going to mess up the acronym. So initially we have protection, right? Yeah. So the P, which means don't do anything silly. This is mainly for acute injuries. So if you have an acute calf strain following a track session, so protect the area, try to offload it a little bit for a short period. And then you have the E, which is elevation. Elevation isn't putting a leg up on top of a sofa, it's having it raised where it's higher than your heart level. And then you have the A, which is the anti-inflammatories, which we spoke about. And then the C is compression. So compression, we know, can be quite useful at controlling swelling. We don't want to try and get rid of it, but we don't want swelling to be there for a long time as well, because that can affect muscle contraction and muscle function. And Wallace is that's the elevation. And then we have the love. So the L is load, so which means loading in terms of like strength training. And then we have optimism. So you have people who approach injuries feeling with a good outlook will tend to do better than those who have higher levels of anxiousness. They'll tend to experience pain for a long time. And I forget what the V is. And then the E, I can't remember that one. Is it?
Good
We've
enough.
got the most important ones. I love the optimism one.
Yeah.
That's so good. And it's so true. I mean, if injuries happen, and they do to pretty much everyone, then you can just focus on the things that you can do. There's literally no point in thinking about everything you can't do.
I remember listening to Charlotte Purdue on your podcast as well, and her outlook on, injuries are going to be part of the process and it's how you approach it. And I thought it was brilliant how she has her outlook on injuries, and it is part of the process, and the ability to take a step back and say, okay, I'm dealing with this now. How can I better myself going forward to minimize the risk in the future? And I will get a lot of athletes who come in who are, competitive club runners trying to get, England vests, and I often find because they feel like they need to go out and perform in race is the level of anxiousness around certain injuries, and often you can see that it can affect as they go forward and return to injuries, and re-injury risk could potentially go up.
Yeah, the power of the mind.
Yeah, that's it.
The other one, which Rose likes to do weekly, is massage. So is that something that can help with injury prevention, or is that another thing where it might work for you, it makes you feel good, and if it does, then that's great?
Yeah, so it would be at the top of the pyramid in terms of like its importance. Like the bottom is the key bits. It would be fairly high up, but again, I would always say to someone, if you feel it works well for you, and so for example, if you have muscle stiffness and muscle soreness and it can reduce that and you move better and you feel better, then I would 100% say keep doing it. I would definitely not turn someone off it. What I would do is if someone has an acute muscle injury, and they're going to get soft tissue, I'm sure you'll have experienced it, like I feel like I might have a bit of a strain. I'm going to go and get some massage, and you perhaps feel worse after it. So you initially within an acute injury, you want to try to avoid having too much because it'll affect the tissue remodeling. So yeah, do it if you want to, not because you have to.
Yeah, once when I ended up having a sacral stress fracture a few years ago, I thought it was tightness in my back. So I was like, I need a massage. And they were going in pretty hard in my back, and it felt good because the pain must have been like radiating everywhere, but I don't think that did any help in the end.
No, and then I see that quite a lot, particularly around the hip and pelvis. When people have, stiffness within the front of the hip, it often gets diagnosed as like a hip flexor injury or a quad strain, and they're getting lots of massage, they're doing lots of stretching to the area, and it's not resolving. Then when they come to see me and I'm having a look at a couple of different tests, like a hop test, I look at their previous injury history, their mileage, look at all those other lifestyle factors, and then my suspicion is raised quite a bit. And from initial onset of the injury to diagnosis, we don't want that to be a long period, but unfortunately it does happen. These get missed.
What are the three, if you can narrow it down to three most common running injuries that you see coming in through your door, what would they be? And can you take us briefly through how to rehab them, how long we need off, how quickly we can get back to running?
Yeah. So the knee would be the number one in terms of areas that we would see. So within the knee we have patellofemoral pain, people will call it runner's knee, which is essentially pain in and around the kneecap. I'm sure you've experienced it as well as I have. That area takes up to 5 times your body weight and peak force when you run, and it generally will occur because someone is exposed to more load than what they're used to. So if you're not used to running, and then all of a sudden you take up running, you feel a bit of knee stiffness, that can be what we refer to as patellofemoral pain. Or running downhill, we put lots of load through the knee. So if you're not used to running downhill, then all of a sudden you start doing loads of downhill, you can feel pain around the front of the knee. So in terms of recovery, number one is making sure you get an accurate diagnosis. So seeing a professional that can rule out anything else. It's a diagnosis of exclusion. Right, we're dealing with patellofemoral pain. Then let's identify things that might contribute. Is there any deficits in your quad strength, your calf strength, your hip strength? So we'll give them a sufficient strength training program, loading program to build up the capacity of that area. And then usually it's a nice gradual build up of your running. So it depends. With that, it really depends on the individual. It could take anything from a couple of weeks to feeling really good to a couple of months to feeling really good. But ultimately, it's not to have fear around knee pain. It's very common. And yeah, just doing good loading exercises and gradually building your running can be really effective. And the other area we see is, I'm sure we've all heard of the term shin splints. It's not a particular diagnosis, because if someone says to me, I have shin splints, okay, I'm thinking that could be 6 or 7 different things. But the most common thing we would see is what we call medial tibial stress syndrome, which is kind of like a bony reaction on the inside of the shin. Now with that, often you might need to drop down your running, focus on some cross training, but usually it's a couple of weeks, but building up your calf strength. The stronger the calf, the stronger the shin bone. And we might look at other biomechanical factors, running gait, but usually it's just a few weeks of dealing with that before we can get someone back to running, and then looking at other factors to reduce the risk of it coming back. And then we've got the Achilles is a classic one, particularly for males, master male runners. We see Achilles injuries quite a lot. You see it in people who are a high body mass index, sedentary, but you also see it at the elite level because of the amount of running that they're doing. And with tendons, one thing I would also say with tendons, it takes time. It takes time. And then the other thing is it takes decent work in the gym. You know, you need to be able to restore the capacity of the tendon. So if we look at calf strength, we would get someone who has an Achilles tendon injury to try and lift between 50% of their body weight. If we look at single leg calf raise, I'm, let's say, 90 kilos, so I need to build up towards 45 kilos, which seems quite a lot. And that can take time. So that's one key thing I would say to runners. Look, this will take time. There's no quick fixes to tendon injuries.
In summary, the prevention and the rehab are actually quite similar. It's good sleep, good nutrition, good strength program, and patience.
Yeah. 4
things that just feed into both ends of the spectrum. And
I think we as runners overcomplicate it sometimes. You know, even clinicians, it's my job to keep it simple for people. And you know, when it comes to running and it comes to injuries, don't let it deter you from continuing running because of all the other health benefits that you get from it. You know, dealing with musculoskeletal pain, or I know fractures can be really frustrating, but you can get better, you can adapt, and that's the great thing about it. I went from running really low level once or twice a week, and now I feel comfortable running 4 or 5 times a week. And I've had a number of injuries along that way, even knowing what I do. But now I'm at a point where I feel like, okay, I know roughly where my sweet spot is and I know how to progress. So if anyone who might be dealing with an injury or gets frustrated with it, is just know that you will adapt, have good resources such as this podcast. And yeah, just like you said, be patient with it as well.
Yeah. And you know how you just said you've had a few running injuries. I found it really funny on your Instagram the other day that someone asked you, as a physio, how are you getting injured? Because you have all the knowledge, but no one's invincible. So can you answer that? Why does a physio get injured?
Yeah, so I mean, we're not the best at taking our own advice. Like when I get injured, I go to see a physio because I need accountability. I need someone to say to me, okay, Aidan, look, this is what we're dealing with. Although I have a very good idea, but this is the amount of time. And often I think when you invest in yourself as well, you're more likely to adhere to doing the exercises. So yeah, the answer to that is none of us are invincible. We're all likely going to pick up an injury. If you look at the research, you're going to get injured at some point or other. Our job is to minimize the risk so that we can kind of maximize the reward when we go forward. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
And this is for each of you, what do you feel has helped you the most within your running journey to reduce the risk of picking up injuries? What do you feel has worked well for you?
Can I go first?
I honestly, and I'm not sucking out to the strength coach here, but I honestly think my strength training program and having consistency with it has been the biggest change for me. I think when I guess it's a combination of that and just having a sensible plan. And it's a really boring answer, but just focusing on consistency all around, not going for, not doing crazy sessions, not trying to do crazy increases, and actually just focusing on, just as we were talking about earlier, doing 80% of the sessions well, doing that, but really focusing on the consistency on the strength training to back all of that up and work on my weaknesses has been the biggest change for me, I think.
No,
and that's
good.
kept everything at bay. I used to really struggle with shin splints, actually. The year before I went pro, and the first kind of 6 months when my shins were a real issue for me. And it was just a constant worry, because whenever I tried to take it up, they'd start hurting, and then I'd be like, oh, I've got to take it down again. And just building up my calf strength and everything else around that as well, and then also managing the load has been the biggest change. And thankfully, touch wood, no issues since.
Yeah. Brilliant. And also, you've not really had any issues since you've gone pro and not working full time, because the recovery as well. So just having that time where you're not squeezing in runs whilst like in between trying to commute to work and everything, that must make a real difference. And
interestingly, it was the strength that would always drop off the to-do list, because I didn't have time, and so I prioritized my sessions and my other running, and then it would always be the strength that fell off the bandwagon.
Yeah.
And what about yourself? I want to come back to touch on that just quickly as well. What about yourself, Steph?
So for me, if I think about when I've had injuries, and the last big injury I had was that stress fracture 4 years ago now. And the reason I had that was increasing load too quickly, probably not paying enough attention to nutrition because I'd increased my load. I didn't have the knowledge that actually with that, I need to pay attention that I'm increasing how much I'm fueling as well. And so I think the combination of that set me back. So since then, I was so scared, like, this can never happen again to me. So I paid much closer attention to, like what you said, sleep, nutrition. And then I would agree with the strength training as well. I think recently I've had very consistent weeks of high mileage, but I don't think I would necessarily be getting through that and recovering as well if I wasn't as strong as I am. And I think doing the sessions week on week in the gym is really helping with that as well.
That's good. And on the S&C side of things as well, and because I know Rich Blagrove will be listening, and he's recently published a study that's been really good. And when you look at the evidence around strength training for running, we can't say that strength training will massively reduce the risk of injury. But the reason is a lot of these interventions that they've looked at are things like TheraBands, are doing really low level strengthening exercises. So we just need better quality studies. Like, for example, with you guys, and Steph, Rose, we did a session last week. You made a great point that when I was there supervising, you felt more comfortable lifting slightly heavier. And this is something that they found within his research as well, is that actually having someone there to observe can help with, like you mentioned, increasing load. And that has been, that's one of the key parts of the research that we find is very useful for runners. So I think with that then is having the confidence to increase the weight gradually. But the more you get comfortable getting under a barbell or lifting dumbbells, the more confident you'll get at increasing. So I think, there's some I'm glad to hear that the strength training is working.
Yeah, and I think also when you almost give me permission to increase the load. So when you've said, why not this week? Like, just add a small bit more. I'm like, okay, I'll try that. And then you realize, oh, it's fine. Like, of course, I can lift like another 5 kilos. And then that just gives you the confidence, like, actually, yes, I can progress this. Whereas before, I wouldn't say, we're runners rather than we're not weightlifters. So it's hard to know what you can handle in the gym. So I think just, building that confidence really can help with the strength.
Yeah, consistency, isn't it?
Yeah.
So many helpful points there, Aidan. Thank you so much again for coming on. And
no worries.
I'm sure it will be super helpful because I know a lot of people will be marathon training right now and hopefully not injured, but I'm sure there might be a few. So hopefully a lot for them to take away.
No, appreciate it. Thanks for having me on again.
Thanks for joining us for 5 Miles Easy.
See you next time.